Hello. Feel free to chime in and say hello if you're here. Looks like we have two viewers, one or two. Maybe it's just me. I'll give, we'll wait a couple seconds here, maybe 2 or 3 minutes just to see who shows up. And then we'll get started in about 5 minutes. Um, Regardless of who shows up, I'm not expecting a big crowd, but we will just kind of get the thing going here. So, like I said, if you're watching, feel free to chime in. Looks like we've got Babu and Tali. Thank you so much for joining the live stream, guys. Babu, I remember he looks like Vincent Van Gogh. Yeah, I kind of do, right? Had to do a self-portrait for my art class this semester as well. I got like 3 different beverages here, so I'm going to just crack open my Coke here. Let me just make sure my computer's all situated. I got my laptop right here so I can kind of check the progress of the stream and all that stuff. I'll just make sure. Can you guys hear me and all that good stuff? Let me know if you can't hear me. Never read the double. Yeah, we're going to be talking about it here today. This whole entire stream is going to be dedicated to Dostoyevsky's The Double. Dostoyevsky is hard, isn't it? Yeah, Dostoyevsky is very difficult. We'll get into that. So I guess we can get started here. We got a couple people. Hopefully you guys will stick around for a little while, pop in and out. Hopefully I don't expect you guys to sit through the whole thing. We're sort of planning on streaming until about 8 o'clock, but we'll kind of just see where it takes us. So I like to kind of start off my videos, in this case the live stream, just kind of giving you guys a little update about what we've been reading. So we did finish My Confederate Kinfolk. You guys can hear more about that in my most recent video. We did a pretty in-depth analysis of this, pretty interesting historical, memoir type, genealogy type stuff from, that took place after the Civil War, during Reconstruction, and all that good stuff. So we did finish this. We're getting through East of Eden. We're about a quarter of the way through here. I'll show you guys where we're at. How do you go through these books so fast? That's a really good question. And I'm not the most prolific reader. I'm not one of those YouTubers that finishes 20 books a month, but I would say I can knock out 1 or 2 books a month, maybe one book a month. It just kind of depends. East of Eden, for example, I've only been reading for maybe 2 weeks, and we're already, got this much knocked out already. So it's been pretty enjoyable. We'll definitely be doing an analysis of East of Eden. And then we have Conquests and Cultures by Thomas Sowell. This documents the sort of the process and the history of enslaved and conquered peoples, and sort of how they come to be influenced by their conquerors, right? Slavery, is obviously a terrible thing, but it also has advantages historically, economically, socially, religiously. So you guys can look up Thomas Sowell, and got a good vegan book for you. Yeah, I don't read too many vegan books. Is that Steinbeck? Yeah, that was Steinbeck, East of Eden. I used to read quite a bit of Steinbeck when I was young, middle school, high school. And he kind of fell off my radar, so now we're kind of getting him back into the rotation. So that's been enjoyable. This is definitely a really good entry novel to Steinbeck, even though it's really, really complex. I definitely recommend it. So let's get into the double, guys. I have the Penguin Classics edition that's juxtaposed with Notes from the Underground. Now, in the way they set this book up, they should have done it in reverse, right? Because the double, the one we're going to be talking about tonight, was written in 1846. Notes from the Underground is from 1864, as you can see there. But what's interesting about this book, the double, is that it could almost serve as a sequel to Notes from the Underground. But if you kind of read it, I wish I had sort of read the double first, right? Because the double comes first. That was one of Dostoyevsky's early works, and sort of established his style that was heavily influenced by Gogol, another Russian writer. And then 1864, we get to Notes from the Underground. And the double, he states it as a poem of St. Petersburg. So obviously it's not a poem, right? But it does take place in St. Petersburg. Now, why he chose to use the word poem, not really quite sure. but maybe he just meant sort of it is very poetic, even though it's not in the traditional, vein of a poem, right? So when we're dealing with Dostoevsky, I'll try to approach this for people who are not familiar with Dostoevsky. Obviously, most of you guys are probably not very familiar with him, but you probably at least heard of him. And then hopefully, some of my viewers, maybe Tali, um, is familiar with Dostoevsky. Um, and I will be checking the comments periodically, but we'll probably check most of the comments at the end. That way I can just kind of get through some things here. So when we're dealing with Russian literature, obviously during this period, we're dealing with Russian nihilism, right? We had the Russian nihilist movement, that was a big sort of countercultural intellectual movement, that didn't directly oppose, the monarchy or the czars, um, in the structures of power in Russia, but it was kind of by default just in direct, um, conflict with it, right? Um, and the Russian nihilist literature genre or movement is pretty in depth. I'm not an expert on Russian history or Russian nihilism, but from the Russian literature that we've sort of gotten under our belt already, we sort of, and we'll talk about the double and we'll talk about Russian nihilism, particularly with Dostoevsky. That's kind of like his modus operandi, right? Obviously, there's other things in there, other than just sort of the depressing nihilism. There's always that light on the horizon. There's always that sort of, burgeoning of trying to get to, almost through the suffering of itself of nihilism. We sort of have this goal to project oneself onto the other side of that suffering, right? Whether that's religious enlightenment, personal enlightenment, social, enlightenment. Um, so, like I said, with the double, dates back to 1846. Now, there's a lot of different sort of synopsises and stuff like that, and it's a very, sort of all over the place narrative. This video is not going to be a plot summary by any means. It's going to be more like an analysis based on the personal notes that I kind of took from it. Right? I think that's the best way to kind of approach literature. And with Dostoevsky, Dostoevsky is difficult. Dostoevsky is definitely not an easy author to digest by any means, but he's an important, author, to get under your belt. And obviously we have the, sort of the degradation in language, translating Russian to English. Some of these translations are rather old. We have the same issue with Leo Tolstoy. But I think as time goes on, the translations get better and better. Hopefully you guys can see. I'm just gonna move my beautiful icon down a little bit so you guys can see that. Um, so, like I said, with Dostoevsky, we have the exploration of the self, the psyche. It's like Jordan Peterson says. Dostoevsky was more of like a sort of a, psychologist, or sort of a, philosophic, psychiatrist, sort of in a way, where Tolstoy was more like a sociologist, right? Focusing more on the bigger picture. Not that Dostoevsky is not doing that, but it's sort of a different aesthetic entirely. Dostoevsky is kind of, the one man on his own, so to speak, whereas somebody like Leo Tolstoy is sort of more like the collective sort of motion of the beast of humanity, right? And we have a little bit of that with Dostoevsky. Now, like I said, this book is set up with Notes from the Underground coming first, but it really should be, in the opposite order. But I think in terms of entry novels, Notes from the Underground, will definitely set the stage for you to kind of understand Dostoevsky, and it's a lot shorter than the double. The double is fairly sprawling. It's almost 300 pages, I would say, at least 250, something like that. The double starts on page 128 in this edition, so it's kind of hard to tell exactly how long it is. So anyway, when we're dealing with the double, like I said, I'm not going to be giving you guys a sort of a chapter by chapter plot summary. We're going to talk more about the themes, and we will talk about some of the major, points in the plot that are sort of, important to the overall theme. Because it's like the form and content, the form and the context creates the meaning, right? Or the form, the content, rather. So you have those two things working together, and they sort of create the meaning, but sometimes the meaning creates the form and the content. So it can be kind of reversed, right? Now, when we're dealing with Dostoevsky or Russian literature, it might kind of seem like this lofty, real cryptic sort of, type of literature that's really hard to understand. And yes, it is all of those things, but it's also, you can relate to Dostoevsky's characters because they suffer, they're depressed, they have goals, they have motivations. Oftentimes they don't meet those expectations, they don't quite meet those goals for various different reasons that we'll get into. Um, so basically, chapter one of the double um, starts out with the narrator. You meet him on the first page. His name is titular counselor Yakov Petrovich Galiatkin. So just remember Galiatkin. Yeah, the names are going to get very confusing. We're not going to get too much into the names and stuff like that. But unlike Notes from the Underground, where you don't really know who the narrator is, we know exactly who the narrator is right in this first page on this first sentence, which I think is pretty cool as far as that goes. So basically, the opening page is Galyakin woke from a long sleep, yawned, stretched, and finally opened his eyes completely. He lay motionless in bed, however, for a couple of minutes more, like a man who is not yet quite sure whether he is awake or still asleep, and whether what is happening around him is real and actual or only the continuation of his disordered dreams. So, already in that first paragraph, obviously we don't know exactly what this man is suffering from, Galyatkin, but already Dostoevsky is setting the stage for a rather troubled, deranged character, right? Pretty much verbatim right off the bat. Now, taking place in St. Petersburg, and what's interesting sort of about Russian society is that it's sort of structured in a way that is, supposed to be loyal to the czars and loyal to the king and sort of loyal to orthodoxy and all this stuff. But underneath that sort of exterior, that shiny religious sort of nationalism or whatever you might call it, proto nationalism, it was a form of nationalism, I guess you could say. You have the sort of the rotten undercore of Russian society, and that's kind of what Dostoevsky's characters are exemplifying. That's what Dostoevsky kind of puts on the page for us, is the suffering characters that are disillusioned with Russian society, right? And that's why you can read Dostoevsky or Tolstoy rather in any sort of context. These authors will be relevant as they are now, and they'll still be relevant, 1,000 years from now or more, because we're all living in a society that we're itching to kind of get out of, right? There's no ideal society, but in St. Petersburg, it's sort of, it's structured on royalty and then middle class and then probably very, very poor people, right? So we have that sort of collection of different people. So again, here I'm paraphrasing. Mr. Galyaktin continues to convulsively close his eyes as though regretting his recent awakening and wishing to bring himself back to sleep for a minute. So he's kind of already, we know we're being introduced to this character that's very troubled, and he's maybe having nightmares. He's obviously having anxiety. He's having all kinds of issues, right? And there's a relatively large cast of characters in the double, but for the most part, all you really need to know is Galyatkin, and then on the second page here, we're introduced to his servant Petrushka. Now, Dostoevsky is very funny, despite his nihilism and his depressive sort of tendencies. He creates these really funny relationships. Even Notes from the Underground is really funny, and just it's sort of, off the cuff nihilism, right? Sort of not giving a crap attitude, sort of. But at the same time, these characters care a great deal about themselves, and that's sort of the root of their suffering. At least with this character, as well as some of his other characters in his other books, and we relate to that. I relate to that. The root of all of our suffering is really a result of our ego, right, or our lack of ego. So he's got this servant named Petrushka, and Petrushka is kind of like a troll, right? He's a good servant, but he doesn't really like say sir and yes, master, or any of that stuff. He kind of just does whatever the heck he wants to do. So that's kind of what's interesting about Petrushka. And they sort of troll each other back and forth. But Petrushka is fairly loyal to Galyatkin, but we do get the sense that Petrushka does get the sense that he's living with kind of a deranged person, right? Galyatkin. Um, so he is Galyatkin is some sort of a diplomat. He's like a lower level diplomat. Works in the offices of kind of the Russian government or something like that. I'm not sure exactly what it means in that context. Um, and then so that's kind of chapter one in a nutshell, right? We're basically just introduced to the narrator or the main character, the protagonist's anxieties. He's got bad sleep cycles, but he does have this funny kind of comforting relationship with Petrushka in a lot of ways. In the novel, Petrushka is really his only friend, his only saving grace, or so we think, right? And then towards the end of chapter one, and getting into chapter two, uh, Galyatkin basically decides to go see Dr. Christian Ivanovich Rutenspitz, a physician and surgeon, a hale and hearty, although now elderly man, endowed with bushy graying eyebrows and whiskers. So, anyways, he's kind of this old guy, and Mr. Galyatkin goes to talk to Christian Ivanovich, Dr. Christian Ivanovich, and sort of is telling him about his anxieties. The doctor says, well, what have you been suffering with? Stay on your medication, that sort of thing. And I took a note here. So Mr. Galyatkin visits Dr. Rutenspitz and is put on meds. So we sort of have just like we do today, we sort of have the medical industrial complex, right? Sort of putting people on pills, solving that emotional, spiritual problem with medicine, right? Which is kind of it's not it's only like a band-aid, right? And we get the sense from Dostoevsky that he realizes that Galyatkin's insanity cannot be solved just by medications or through routine visits to the doctor. Just making sure nothing's lagging here. Thank you for joining the live stream, guys. I will catch up with the comments. You should read the Canterbury Tales. Yes, I actually have the Canterbury Tales on my shelf. It's up there. I have the Penguin edition, I think. So that's definitely on our reading list. So I hope you guys are enjoying the Dostoevsky stuff. Like I said, some of you guys might not be familiar with Dostoevsky, but hopefully this will inspire you to get into him. Okay, so on page 137, he's talking to his doctor. His doctor says, well, just, try to do the best you can, sort of. And he has a fairly friendly relationship with his doctor, but as the novel unfolds, we kind of learn that his doctor is not really being friendly to him. He's kind of keeping him under his thumb, sort of as an out. He's sort of looking at him through a bird's eye view. And there's a lot of paranoia with Galyatkin. He starts going to the first page, we kind of get a sense of his irrationality. But on top of that, he doesn't trust his doctor. He doesn't trust his servant. He thinks everyone is basically trying to get one up on him. And okay, so here we have a sort of an esoteric reference, right? He's talking to his doctor. He says, I don't try to belittle those who may be better than you and me, that is. I mean to say than me, Christian Ivanovich. I didn't mean to say you. I dislike hints. I don't like petty, two-faced people. I loathe gossip and scandal mongering. Now here's the esoteric part, right? I only put on a mask at masked balls. I don't wear one in public every day. I will only ask you, Christian Ivanovich, how will you set about revenging yourself on an enemy, your bitterest enemy, somebody you hadn't thought of in that way? Mr. Galyatkin ended with a challenging glance. So we sort of have, and we had this in not only in War and Peace from Tolstoy, but we had it in Notes from the Underground, where that's part of Russian society. They go to mask balls and stuff like that. So there's obviously, some kind of cult-like activity going on, at least in the higher ups. And that's kind of how you get into the higher Russian society, at least in this time, was to kind of go schmooze at these masked balls. And he's obviously not invited to a lot of them because, the short of it is nobody really knows who Galyatkin is. And so let's move on to my other notes here. And then we have, so the second chapter, let me make sure I got this right here. So chapter 2 is basically him going to the doctor and then we have the mention of the mask balls, and we have sort of his confession to his doctor about his irrational thoughts, his paranoia, and he's sort of alluding to the fact that he's being stalked by somebody, right? And that's sort of his alter ego or his double. Now, I don't want you guys to get the wrong idea about this concept of the double. It's not like a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde thing. Well, actually, it kind of is, but it's not like he's actually being stalked by anybody or being followed. I think what Dostoevsky is basically trying to tell us is that the double is sort of a result of his own, what's going on in his own deranged mind. And the double is sort of his alter ego and his the best version of himself that he's unable to be, right? And we all have doubles. I think that's what's so compelling about this particular novel, is that psychologically pretty much anybody can relate to it on that level. um, so he gets home from the doctor, right? And he's drinking a lot of vodka. He's going out to these bars with all of his friends, and he's trying to sort of schmooze his way, or germ as they call it in Nashville. You go to Nashville and you try to, step ahead in line of somebody that's been there, busting their chops for longer than you. That's called germing. And that's kind of what Galyakin is doing. He's trying to he's been in the same sort of low level diplomat position for quite some time. And he's got these complicated relationships, and he's got social anxiety. And that's another major theme of Galyakin and Dostoevsky, just all across the board, is how do we psychologically and spiritually deal with social anxiety. Um, okay, so he says here, and drunk one glass of vodka. Mr. Galyakin sat down in an armchair, glanced modestly about him, and peacefully applied himself to the columns of a thick national newspaper. So we get the sense that he's aware of the outside world, kind of like the character in Notes from the Underground. He's pretty well educated, right? And that's a source of his anxiety, is that he sees all these sort of upper echelon, kind of lofty, more educated people, and he wants to be part of that, but he just can't, right? We can all kind of relate to that. Now here's when Galyakin sort of admits to the reader that he does have sort of a split personality. Um, Let me tell you something in a friendly way, said our hero after a short silence, as if he had made up his mind. So be it then, to confide something in them. You all know me, gentlemen, but up till now you have only known one side of me. Nobody is to blame for that, and I admit it as partly my own fault. So he's basically saying, you know, I got problems. I've got multiple personalities. But he's also kind of saying, in a way, despite all my failures, if you give me another chance, I can do better, right? So that's kind of what we're getting at. Until now, you have not known me, gentlemen. It would not be entirely appropriate for me to explain myself here now. I will only tell you something casually in passing. There are people, gentlemen, who do not like deviousness and who wear a mask only at mask balls. So again, we have sort of the esoteric reference to the mask balls. And that is sort of a metaphor for obviously the double. Galyakin is sort of wearing a mask, right? He's not only wearing the mask at the mask balls, but he's wearing a mask in his daily life. I don't want to stay and get a spoiler. Yeah, it's book is up for summer since I'm off from college. This is a cool stream. Yeah, I'm glad you are enjoying it. Yeah, very much like Eyes Wide Shut, Babu. Very, very good sort of analysis. Yeah, like the character in Eyes Wide Shut was kind of doing the same thing. He was kind of inadequate. He was kind of being cucked by his wife, right? And all this stuff. And then he shows up at the mask ball. So that's definitely what we're dealing with. And you get the sense from this. That's actually a really good point to mention, because that's where the paranoia comes from, because there is sort of this outside sort of cult-like nature that surrounds Russian society, that it's almost, and that's why these people are so paranoid, is because they feel like they're being watched or controlled by somebody. Now, mostly it's all in their head, right? Because of their own shortcomings, but at the same time, it is sort of they've sort of gotten themselves too deep into these certain social classes that they're struggling to sort of get through. Now there will be spoils in here, but it's not going to be anything. It's still going to be worth reading, Um, because the book is so complex, there's really no way I could really spoil it. It's a very, very complex read. There are people who do not regard acquiring the ability to polish a parquet floor with their shoes as the true purpose of human life. There are people, too, gentlemen, who will not say they are happy and living life to the full just because, for example, their trousers are a good fit. Finally, there are people who don't care to caper about and fidget aimlessly and flirt and make advances, or most of all, thrust their noses in where they are not wanted. I have said almost everything, gentlemen. Now permit me to leave you. So he's sort of that inside monster, that sort of Dr. Jekyll sort of vibe is sort of unfolding from Galiotkin here. Um, and we sort of get the sense that the narrator is not only paranoid, but he feels constantly humiliated. He's always feeling like everybody's laughing at him and so on and so forth. Um, So let's see here. And there's also a little bit of romance here. Galiakin sort of falls for this woman. We'll come upon her name here shortly. So there's feelings of death in here. He says he hardly knew what he was doing, however, since at that moment he felt decidedly more dead than alive. Noticing a woman's figure at a first floor window, Mr. Galiakin blew her a kiss. So this could be the woman that he's interested in, or could just be a random woman, but he's feeling that sort of sense of rejection, even though he hasn't really received any rejection, right? Because his self-esteem is that bad. It's like somebody just grabbed his feelings and crumpled it up into a ball and threw it across the room or something. I just wrote here feelings of death. So there's also there's a little passage here that I think is kind of interesting. Mr. Galiotkin was left alone. Everything went dark before his eyes. Now, this is after he got home, after he's been trying to schmooze at the office and at the bars and sort of these masked balls. Everything went from dark before his eyes. He felt utterly crushed and now stood in a kind of stupefied abstraction, as though recalling some circumstances only extremely stupid that had come about very recently. "Oh dear," he whispered, smiling with an effort. Meanwhile, the sound of voices and footsteps on the stairs, probably belonging to more guests invited by Olsofisi Ivanovitch, reached him from below. As he came to it and prepared to take his place, Mr. Galiakin found himself mentally entertaining the desire to sink through the ground or hide himself together with his carriage in a mouse hole. It seemed to him that everything, whatever in Ivanovitch's house, was staring at him through the windows. He knew that if he turned around, he would die on the spot. So again, we have that paranoia, social anxiety, paranoia. I mean, the guy is just all over the place. And we're not really getting, it's entertaining and it's insightful because it's so crazy, but we're not really getting a valid sort of representation of his social interactions because the narrator is so deranged. So you kind of have to take the narrator for a grain of salt, but through the narrator's insanity, that's kind of the enlightenment of the experience of reading it, right? Because you're seeing his suffering, you're living through his eyes. It's told, there's an omnipresent narrator, but it's heavily told through I guess you could say, the first person, right? So chapter 4, the day on which was celebrated the festival of the birth of Clara Alfonzovna. These Russian names, they're crazy. Only daughter of state. So basically, Clara, who is this woman here? Okay, so that's the woman that he's interested in. They're basically having a festival for Clara, and that's the woman that he is interested in. But I confess, humbly confess, I could never have described all the majesty of that moment when the queen of the festivities herself, Clara Olsofenya, glowing like a fresh-picked rose with a blush of modesty and happiness, fell, overcome by her feelings, into the embrace of her tender mother. How the tender mother dissolved in tears, and how upon this the father himself burst into sobs. So, and a beauty for a daughter sobbed like a child and proclaimed through his tears that his excellency was a man of the greatest. So basically, he's sort of observing the love that this woman gets from her family, right? And for the most part, the love that he feels for Clara is relatively unrequited, right? There's really no feedback that we really get from her I think they do have some sort of a friendship or something like that. And like I said, it's very complex. There's a lot going on. Um, and like we said in the beginning of this stream, um, the surface level themes or even the deeper level themes are pretty easy to understand. But at the same time, what Dostoevsky is kind of doing is almost like a cryptic, very heavily layered, almost Shakespearean thing. You can't really get the full gambit of Tolstoy's genius just from reading like one, having one read through. You have to go back and read it again. But I think the double was just so kind of confusing, kind of draining for me that I'm not going to immediately do a reread. So here's just one little sentence here. So after sort of the festivities have kind of all blown over, he's not feeling much affection or love from Clara. He said he had already promised himself that he would blow his brains out before the night was over. Having promised himself this, Mr. Galyakin thought to himself, here goes, and to this own immense surprise, quite unexpectedly began to talk. So he's sort of you're sort of getting not only Galyakin's actions in social settings, but you're also getting his sort of crazy internal monologue. And like I said, it's hard to know exactly what's taking place sometimes in this novel because you don't know if it's all in his head. Is he hearing voices? Are people actually kind of looking at him with scorn and resentment? So very interesting. Um, let's see here. I highlighted this other part. So sort of like Notes from the Underground, the content of the way that he describes the weather sort of forms the deeper underlying feelings of the protagonist. It was snowing and raining both together. Jets of rainwater broken off by the wind spouted all but horizontally as it as if from fire hoses, pricking and cutting the wretched Mr. Galyatkin's face like thousands of pins and needles. So the weather serves as another way that Mr. Galyatkin is being beat down, right? He's being beat by society. He's being beat in his love life. He's being beat by himself. He's being beat by his insanity. And of course, the Russian weather is not really helping matters, right? So it's just kind of a clever, funny way that Dostoevsky sort of illustrates the insanity of these characters, and he does it very well. Although the snow, rain, and all the conditions for which there is not even a name, which prevail when blizzard and tempest rage under the November sky of St. Petersburg, had assailed Mr. Galyakin, already crushed by his misfortune suddenly and all at once, showing him not the slightest mercy, giving him not a moment's respite, piercing him to the marrow, plastering up his eyes, blowing right through him from every direction, driving him off of his course and out of his last remaining wits. Mr. Galyakin, as though purposely joining in league and concert with all his enemies to bring the ruin of this day, his evening and his night to a triumphant completeness. In spite of it all, Mr. Galyakin remained almost insensitive to this last evidence of the malignancy of fate. So, the weather, it seems like kind of an insignificant thing, and they always tell you, don't spend too much time describing the weather, but it can be very effective in certain situations. I did highlight this other paragraph here. Now, like I said, the reason I can't give you a plot summary is because he's constantly going. He's either in his house or he's at the doctor's or he's at a masked ball or he's at work or he's at a after party or he's at some kind of, he's all over the place. So it's kind of it's hard to keep track of, right? So on page 168, this is when the double sort of manifests itself. Now there were some inklings of it before, right? In his paranoia, in his nightmares, perhaps. But for the most part, it's all on this page here, at least the beginning of it. Dear, dear, what on earth is the matter with me? Mr. Galyakin repeated once more, setting out on his way again, still occasionally glancing round. Meanwhile, a new kind of feeling began to make itself evident in all Mr. Galyakin's being. Not exactly depression, not exactly fear, but a feverish shiver ran through his veins. It was unbearably unpleasant. Well, it doesn't matter, he said to give himself heart. Well, it doesn't matter. Perhaps it's nothing at all. No stain on anybody's honor. Perhaps it had to happen. He went on himself, not understanding what he was saying. Perhaps it will all turn out for the best in its own good time, and there will be no recriminations, and nobody will be put in the wrong. Talking this way, trying with the words to lighten his mood, Mr. Galliakin gave himself a slight shake and brushed off the snowflakes with which his hat, his collar, his coat, his cravat, and his shoes. So, and also the snow sort of acts as a way, the rain and the snow and the clouds, it's sort of shrouding the mystery of what's actually wrong with Galliakin, right? He could still not succeed in shaking off or freezing himself of the strange feeling, his terrible black depression. So we're getting, Dostoevsky is setting up the stage and basically telling us that this guy is already depressed before the double sort of manifests itself. Um, no sooner had Mr. Galliakin said or thought this than he caught sight of a figure coming towards him, probably some belated wanderer like himself. On the face of it, it seemed a trivial chance encounter, but for some unknown reason, Mr. Galliakin was troubled and even afraid, and felt at a loss. It was not that he feared this might be some bad character, he was simply afraid. And besides, who knows? This thought came to him into Mr. Galliakin's mind. Perhaps this passerby is he himself. Perhaps he is here, and what matters most, he is not here for nothing. He has a purpose. He is crossing my path. He will he will brush against me. He was walking swiftly, like Mr. Galliakin, was bundled up in clothes from head to foot, and again, like him, trotted and pranced along the pavement with small pattering steps and slight hop in his gait. What is this? What is it? Whispered Mr. Galliakin incredulously, and he was shaking all over. What on earth is the matter with me? He thought with vexation. Why am I behaving like this? Have I gone out of my mind in good earnest? So, and the way that Dostoevsky sets it up, it's so easy to visualize this other sort of specter, this other ghostly character that is sort of following him around or almost mocking him, walking in front of him, going to all his appointments. And Mr. Galliakin is just kind of like, what is that? But really what I think it is, sort of my interpretation is, now it could be a visual or sort of a mental experience that he is feeling. Maybe he is seeing it like in terms of schizophrenia, because I think this character is schizophrenic. So we're probably experiencing not only schizophrenia but paranoia, delusions of grandeur, visions, possibly other, maybe he's on some kind of medication that's making him hallucinate. But apart from all of that, it's basically his other self that he is unable to be, and that's what's haunting him. That's sort of what creates the double, right? Here we have another little interesting metaphor. A miserable lost dog went through and shivering, attached itself to Mr. Galliakin, and hurried along beside him, running sideways with tail and ears drooping, and from time to time looking hastily and timidly up at him. So I wrote here depression, paranoia, dread, darkness, anxiety, rain, and snow. So those are all the things that Galliakin is sort of giving us in terms of his mental state, and even the rain is kind of getting on his nerves, right? Mr. Galliakin had recognized his nocturnal acquaintance. Mr. Galliakin's nocturnal acquaintance was none other than himself. Mr. Galliakin himself, another Mr. Galliakin, but exactly the same as himself, in short, in every respect, what is called his double. So that is at the end of chapter 5. Basically, you get introduced to the double. The first couple chapters, chapters 2, 3, 4, and 5, set the stage for sort of what's been going on with Galliakin. What does he do socially? What does he do economically? Who does he know? Who does he not know? But by the time we get to chapter 6, things start really unfolding. The next morning at exactly 8 o'clock, Mr. Galliakin came back to consciousness in his own bed. So it's almost like a Lon Chaney, almost like a Wolfman thing type of deal. Like he wakes up the next day and he has no idea what just happened. And he goes into these real descriptive sort of narratives of his mental state. This is how I feel during a California winter. Yeah. I definitely relate to that. Some of you guys are still talking about the Canterbury Tales. Pilgrim's Progress is better than in that vein. I'm not sure what Pilgrim's Progress. I think it's a book, right? I'll have to check up on that. So basically, he's having these crazy visions slash nightmares slash visions of his double, right? Now, I wrote this question here at the bottom of this page. Is the double another personification of Galyakin's mental illness? Yes, basically it is. Dostoevsky's worldview seems to suggest that Russian society breeds madness in people. So we talked about Russian nihilism in the beginning of this stream. We talked about the suppression of kind of the Russian people or whatever. I'm not saying that all of them were oppressed, but if we read somebody like Dostoevsky or even Leo Tolstoy, you definitely get the sense that people are mentally ill or people are broken because of their society, and that's been going on for forever, right? Um, we have this little passage here. At length, in his boredom and his depression, he began to want to get something settled quickly, no matter how. So the character's also bored. He's depressed. He's kind of bored and stuff like that. So here's the part where I sort of mentioned the Russian society breeds madness in people. And indeed, he had cause to be. The man now sitting opposite Mr. Galyatkin was Mr. Galyatkin's horror. He was Mr. Galyatkin's shame. He was Mr. Galyatkin's nightmare of the previous day. In short, he was Mr. Galyatkin himself, not the Mr. Galyatkin who now sat in his chair with his mouth gaping and the pen frozen in his grasp, not the one who liked to keep in the background and bury himself in the crowd. No, finally, the one whose demeanor said so clearly, leave me alone and I'll leave you alone, or leave me alone, I'm not interfering with you, am I? No, this was another Mr. Galyatkin, a completely different one, and yet at the same time very like the other, of the same height and build, dressed in the same way, and with the same bald patch. In short, nothing, absolutely nothing was lacking to complete the resemblance, so that if they were taken and placed side by side, sounds like they're mowing the lawn out there. Nobody, absolutely nobody, would have taken it onto himself to say which was the old and which was the new. So he's seeing sort of this weird specter, that he can't be, right. But he's also seeing different manifestations of his personality and his failed, suppressed personality. So, like I said, the plot is all over the place. But you can basically just take the introspection, and that's really where all the meaning is. It doesn't really matter what Galyakin is necessarily doing. Obviously, there's some characters like Petrushka and Doctor, whatever his name is, um, that are important to sort of how they manifest Galyakin's lack of progress in the novel, or how they sort of hurt his feelings or make him feel a certain way. But basically, the whole entire meaning of Dostoevsky's The Double is basically all in the insane introspection that we get, sort of the hyper analytical introspection. Um, Now, there's something confusing that happens here where he starts addressing Galyakin as another. He has like another name too. Those damn Russians, man. So at some point, Mr. Galyakin is having dinner, right? And then all of a sudden the double shows up, and Mr. Galyakin basically confesses, gets a bunch of confessions from the double, such as this. Mr. Galyakin's Jr. So basically, we have Mr. Galyakin Sr., which is the real Galyakin, and then Dostoevsky starts calling Mr. Galyakin Jr. the double. So we have the double, and then we have Mr. Galyakin Jr. and Sr. Then we have this other character called Petrovich or something that I think is related to, it's either Petrovich or somebody like that. But anyway, Mr. Galyakin Jr.'s story lasted for 3 or 4 hours. So basically, the double is basically monopolizing the real Galyakin's time. He's sort of seducing everybody in these public settings. He's one-upping the real Galyakin. Mr. Galyakin's Jr.'s story lasted for 3 or 4 hours. The history of his adventures was, however, made up of the most trivial, the most meager, if that word is possible, happenings. It was a story of government service somewhere in a court in the province of prosecuting lawyers and chairman of the bench. Galyatkin suffered in spite of his complete innocence of his very old aunt. So he's kind of just going on and on here. But Mr. Galyatkin starts crying, right? Because he's like so humiliated by what Galyatkin Jr. is sort of doing to him. Basically, he's following the real Galyatkin around, and sort of showing everybody else how much of a failure the real Galyakin is. Imagine such a terrible thing, and it's not that outlandish because it's like that's what we do, and I think that's why this novel kind of disturbs me is because I kind of do the same thing. I have this other version of myself that I wish I could be. I think we all do, right? And then we kind of sit in our own sufferings because we did not do what our alter ego would have done or should have done or could have done, right? Any redeemable characters? Yeah, I would say, Galyakin is very redeemable. By the end of the novel, you feel really sorry for him. He's not like the guy from Notes from the Underground. He's not a terrible narcissistic kind of guy. He's just real sick and real defeated. Um, so that's kind of where that goes. So let's skip ahead here. So basically, it's kind of hard to understand, but the Mr. Galyatkin basically starts inviting his double over all the time. He starts inviting his double out. Sometimes his double will just stalk him and sort of come along unannounced. But for the most part, Galyatkin is sort of aware of his double or Mr. Galyatkin Jr. and sort of starts to entertain him. They're sort of having this dialogue from page to page, and they're fighting and they're kind of mocking each other, right? Mr. Galyakin awoke next morning as usual at 8 o'clock, and as soon as he was awake, he remembered everything that had happened in the previous evening, remembered it with a frown. So for some reason now he's able to kind of start remembering things. Oh dear, what a fool I made of myself yesterday, he thought, raising himself on his pillows and glancing at his visitor's bed. But to his great surprise, the room was empty not only of his guests, but of the bed on which he had slept as well. What's this? Mr. Galyakin shrieked. What on earth could have happened? So it does appear to be on the surface physical, sort of the biological, physiological level, it does appear to be a physical specter. So we are dealing with a very possible schizophrenic or something along those lines. But obviously there's nobody really there, right? That's the saddest and the most scary part about this book is that there's nobody there. It's all in the man's head, and he's projecting and he's creating this other version of himself almost to sort of compensate and exist in this cruel society that he's felt wronged by. You're a fool, Petrushka. He's talking to his servant here. You're a fool, Petrushka. I'm your master, aren't I? Said Mr. Galyatkin. Petrushka said nothing, but looked at Mr. Galyatkin in such a way that the latter crimsoned up to his eyes. It was a look of such insulting reproach that it was no better than downright abuse. So we're getting the sense that Petrushka is watching him unravel, and Petrushka is kind of tired of playing these games with him. But for some reason, it takes the entire novel for them to kind of turn him over. And they could have been trying to give him a chance and stuff, right? But I think all the while, Galyakin Sr., the real Galyakin, is constantly burning bridges, right? And he's constantly sort of not acting when he's supposed to because he's living vicariously through Galyakin Jr., his alter ego. Mr. Galyakin Jr. appeared not to notice Mr. Galyakin Sr., although he was almost knocked him down. So basically, it's weird. It's like Mr. Galyakin Jr., or Sr. rather, is obviously very aware of Mr. Galyakin Jr. because Galyakin Sr. created Galyakin Jr., right, through his own mind. And sometimes we get the sense that Galyakin Jr. notices him, but it's not in the same observational sense that Galyakin Sr. Notices him. The way that Mr. Galyakin interacts with his double, or the way that the double interacts with Mr. Galyakin, is sort of, comically, spitefully. He's sort of living. It's like he's just living without the real Galyatkin, and that's kind of how he interacts with the real Galyatkin. If that makes any sense, guys. So he's unable to basically the short of it is the double lives vicariously through Mr. Galyakin, or maybe it's the other way around. I'm not sure how you would exactly explain that, but it's sort of both ways. So again, here we says reference and mention of masks and the ulterior motives of people. So he's basically talking to Antonovich. I feel absolutely all that, sir, but I didn't mean that, sir. I was talking about masks. Masks, sir? That is, again, I am afraid you may take my idea in the wrong way. I mean the idea of my speeches, as you say, Anton Antonovich. I am only developing a theme, Anton Antonovich. Now, for some reason in Russian literature, at least with Dostoevsky, he constantly repeats people's names. It would be like if I went up to somebody and said, hi, Michael. Yes, Michael. Michael. They just repeat things. It kind of forms this cute sort of. It must be like the way that it translates in Russian or something that comes across as kind of funny and cute. But anyway, I'm only developing a theme. This I am putting forward to the notion that people wearing masks have ceased to be a rarity. And that is difficult nowadays to recognize the man under the mask. So, there you have it. No, sir, Anton Itonovich, I was speaking of myself, for example. I put on a mask only when it is requisite. That is exclusively for carnivals and convivial gatherings, speaking in the ordinary sense. But I do not wear a mask to people every day, speaking in another more occult sense. That's what I meant. So we have references to mask balls. We have references to the occult. We have mental illness. He's drinking vodka. He's paranoid. He's on some kind of medication that we're not quite sure of. And all these external factors, the alcohol, perhaps the medication he's on, his paranoia, his schizophrenia, his social ineptness, all of that is basically the catalyst for the double, right? Now, you could maybe rewind things and say, oh, but the double was going to come out anyway at some point, right? And that might be true, but they're sort of interdependent. His emotional and mental, worldview is basically, strikes the match for what is happening to him socially, or vice versa. So, what does Dostoevsky mean by wearing masks in a more occult sense? Now, is he talking about? Now, is he saying personally that Mr. Galyakin is sort of wearing a mask, and Mr. Galyakin is trying to hint that the real Galyakin that is doing all these grandiose things that he thinks people are seeing is the real Galyakin, or is he sort of saying that he's sort of telling people that he's mentally ill, and that's sort of a form of a mask? There's a lot of different ways you can kind of interpret it. Let's see here. So he's fighting with Mr. Galyakin Jr. suddenly and unexpectedly, without rhyme or reason, totally against Mr. Galyakin Sr.'s will, or overpowering him in the momentary struggle that had arisen between them, gained possession of the document required by his superiors. And instead of scraping it in all sincerity with a knife, as he had treacherously assured Mr. Galyakin Sr. he would, rapidly rolled it up, tucked it under his arm, and 2 bounds was beside Andrei Filipovich. So basically, there's this confusing sort of sequence of events that occurs, and there's like these letters and documents that the real Galyakin is supposed to be responsible for, and he's supposed to be delivering these documents, whatever they are, or letters. But for somehow the Galyakin Jr., the double, sort of hijacks this process, right? And that's another way that the character starts to feel humiliated, is because the double, Mr. Galyakin Jr., is basically running him around in circles and doing his job 10 times better than he actually could. Now, is this actually taking place? I don't think it's actually taking place. I think it's all in his head. But for some reason, the cast of characters do react to this. But really what's taking place is, Mr. Galyakin is kind of getting confused, and people are sort of, taking the letter and say, oh, I'll deliver this letter for you. I'll get this document over to so-and-so or something. But Galyakin sort of starts to believe that everybody is conspiring against him or something, is what I've gathered. Very, very complex. It's hard to kind of understand through one reading. So now he's questioning his experience with the double. It was probably some sort of dream, or it somehow seemed different from what really happened. or probably it was me walking along and I somehow took myself for someone else. In short, the whole thing's quite impossible. So that's another thing that makes this kind of difficult and complex, but also rational, is that we have the awareness and the struggle between rationality and irrationality, and the slow descending madness of this pitiful, pathetic character that can't help himself, but he's very well aware that this is probably not real. It's almost like he's constantly knocking on his head and he's like, wake up, what's going on here? This is not really happening, you know? Um, so, and there's a lot of clerks and different counselors and different characters that kind of pop up here. Um, so basically, the Mr. Galyatkin sort of admits here, Mr. Galyatkin proposed to wait until such time as the mask fell from certain faces and something came to light. For this is what first necessarily for the office hours to come to an end as soon as possible. Afterwards, when the office was closed, he would take a certain step. After taking the step, he would know what to do and how to arrange his whole campaign in order to crush the serpent and bring low the horn of pride. So we have sort of some esoteric, sort of demonic references there. And that's kind of what makes it scary. It's like, yeah, it's all happening in his head, but there's glimpses of this sort of demonic entity that's haunting him, right? Reference to the serpent and metaphor of the doormat as characters' feelings. So I think I forgot to highlight that part, but he basically it's right here. I have been a doormat, not a Galyatkin, an ignoble and dirty doormat, and yet not simply a doormat, but a doormat with self-respect, a doormat with feelings and soul, even if the self-respect and the feelings were dumb, and though they might be hidden deep in the filthy recesses of the doormat, yet still with feelings. So that's a little confusing, but he's basically saying he's a doormat. Everybody's walking all over him, but he still wants better for himself, right? Now here's, let's see here. So then he starts writing letters to either himself. There's a guy called Yakov Petrovich, and then there's Galyatkin, and there's a couple other characters, and they start exchanging these documents, and I kind of lost kind of the premise of what was going on because they were sending these letters to each other and stuff. It says here, Petrushka gets drunk and Galyatkin thinks he lost the letter. So basically, yeah, he's drinking too much out at these pubs with all these crazy people, right? And plus, his mind is going, and he's being stalked by the double, or he's stalking the double himself, or whatever. And he sort of loses track of what letter he's supposed to be receiving and what letter he's supposed to be sending out. And then he starts kind of quarreling with Petrushka because he's blaming Petrushka. It's almost like he's going senile or something, right? But basically, Petrushka kind of has no idea what he's talking about, or maybe he does. And you sort of get the sense that Galyatkin's paranoia is definitely not all for nothing. They could maybe be conspiring against him. He says here, look here, you good-for-nothing scoundrel, began Mr. Galyatkin, choking with rage and almost at his wit's end. What have you done to me? Tell me, what have you done to me? You've cut my throat, you scoundrel. You've cut the head off my shoulders, you Judas. So we have this almost biblical reference to the kiss of Judas. He talks about it here. He calls Galyatkin, or he calls Galyatkin calls Petrushka a Judas, right? So he's feeling that paranoia is manifesting itself in sort of this larger esoteric theme of the kiss of Judas, right? You know, Judas portraying Jesus at the Last Supper and all that good stuff. I think that was Judas, right? I mean, I'm getting mixed up with somebody else. But yeah, we have that aspect of betrayal that comes from the Bible, obviously, right? You idle creature, you're drunk. You can go to sleep now, you scoundrel. Tomorrow you'll catch it, added Mr. Galyatkin in a scary, audibly voice. As for Petrushka, he grumbled a few more words than he could be heard lying down on the bed, so that if he creaked, the prolonged yawning and stretching, and finally he was snoring, and he slept the sleep of the just, as they say. Mr. Galyatkin was left neither dead nor alive. Petrushka's behavior, his hints extremely strange, although so remote, that they gave no excuse for being annoyed, especially if it was a drunken man who made them happen or something. So he's quarreling with his only friend, Petrushka, right? Petrushka's kind of turning against him. Petrushka's watching him go crazy. Um, so I could get into these letters here. That Galiot, the double, either it's kind of unclear whether Galiotkin is actually writing these letters or if the double is writing these letters. And they're kind of dense and they're kind of long. And they're sort of talking about some of the other characters that are in the novel. Says here, after he read the letters, our hero remained for a considerable time sitting motionless on the sofa. A new light was breaking through the cloud of obscurity and mystery that had enveloped him for the past 2 days. So we sort of have this back and forth of sanity versus insanity. When he wakes up, he almost comes to, and he almost says, okay, something's wrong. I need to get help. This is not really happening. But then within the next hour, or within the next chapter, he falls right back into the same paranoia. He's obviously not getting the help he needs. So he says here, the previous day's happenings had shaken Mr. Galiotkin to his foundations. Galiotkin's sleep fantasies among his friend, Junior. Okay, so there's a sense of grandiosity, kind of like we had in Notes from the Underground, right? Where the character was not only trying to one-up himself, but his ego is, the main source of his suffering, because what his ego does to him, his ego ends up embarrassing him, ends up making him look like a fool, ends up causing him to burn bridges, but then his ego just pulls him right back and says, do it again, right? That's why it's almost a form of narcissism, an egotistical narcissism, right? But it's also mental illness. It's not the same narcissism that we would have with Notes from the Underground, where it's just this, deliberately narcissistic, petty person. It's more of, that's why he's kind of redeemable in a sense. Hey, Dreama. Hey, Davida, how you all doing? This one's called The Double. Yeah, it was Judas. Yeah, so I got that right. Yeah. So somebody, yes, that we had Tally ask any redeemable characters. So I would say Mr. Galiotkin is redeemable. So we're getting towards the tail end of this. Let's see here. So he has another humiliating nightmare where he says it was terrible, sheer witchcraft, nothing else, and everybody was glad to see him. Everybody liked him. Everybody praised him to the skies. He's talking about his alter ego. He's talking about the double, right? Everybody proclaimed in chorus that his amiability and his satirical gifts were infinitely superior to the amiability and the satirical gifts of the real Mr. Galiotkin. Thus shaming the innocent real Mr. Galiotkin, rejecting the upright Mr. Galiotkin, driving the loyal Mr. Galiotkin away with blows, showering insults on the real Mr. Galiotkin's well-known love of his neighbor. In anguish and horror and frenzy, the tormented Mr. Galiotkin dashed out into the street and hailed a cab so he could rush straight to His Excellency, or if not there, at least to Andrei Filipovich, which, oh horror. Okay, so basically he's going back and forth in these carriages. They take him around in carriages. Seems like there's a theme of the fear of being backstabbed. Yeah, definitely, paranoia. And that could be the root of Galiotkin's entire problem himself. His whole problems themselves, but it's also, we get the sense that it's schizophrenia, narcissism, drug addiction, alcoholism, maybe. So he's going back and forth between these different, his double, or what he perceives to be his double, is sort of humiliating him, and he's running him around in circles, and the real Galiotkin is having to do damage control, basically, right? It's almost like he's gaslighting himself or something. So it says here, I wrote some notes, real Mr. Galiotkin versus other or imagined ones discrediting. So basically that's what the double does. The double basically, whether it's actually happening or if it's just the fault of the real Galiotkin's own failures, social failures, but the double starts to really humiliate this character. And that's when things get desperate, because the Galiotkin is having to try to do damage control, right? Now, there's another letter here that he sent to Yakov Petrovich, and there's clues in here. He says, either you or I, one or the other, but both of us all together is impossible. And I must therefore inform you that your strange, ludicrous, and altogether impossible desire to seem to be my twin. So this is what I was talking about before. It gets confusing because Petrovich, yeah, he starts to call his double Yakov Petrovich. I'm not sure why. So we have Galyakin and we have Galyakin Senior, which is the double, and now we have Yakov Petrovich. And he starts writing a letter to him. I must inform you that your strange, ludicrous, and altogether impossible desire to seem to be my twin and pass yourself off as me as the same person will lead to nothing but your utter disgrace and defeat. And therefore, I beg you, in your own interest, to stand aside and leave the way clear of genuinely noble people with honorable claims. In the opposite case, I am prepared to resolve on the most extreme measures. I lay down my pen and wait. However, I am ready either to be at your service for pistols. So he's he's getting increasingly more paranoid about this character. He starts to write him letters. It's really strange stuff. Um, Now that's the letter writing is sort of an example of how deranged he actually is, because he's writing letters to this alter ego or this perceived double. Um, so we have these constant passages about his shame and his embarrassment and stuff like that. Then I wrote here, Mr. Galyakin fights Junior Galyakin uh, on the wagon. So he's basically trying to kick him out of the wagon. Then he writes another letter to Clara here. He writes this heartfelt letter here. He says, noble sufferer on my behalf, eternally dear to my heart, I suffer, I perish, save me. The wicked intriguer, whose evil tendencies are so well known, caught me in his toils that I was lost. I fell, but he is abhorrent to me, while we have been kept apart. My letters to you have been intercepted, and it was all the work of that vile man, making use of his only good quality, his likeness to you. One may always be ugly and yet captivate by the force of intellect, feeling. So I've kind of lost exactly what he's getting at here, but he's basically saying that his failures with Clara are a result of the double, right? Pretty strange stuff. So we also have these references. We had the kiss of Judas. We sort of had the biblical reference, but obviously Orthodox or Russian Orthodox Russian society in general, at least especially back then, was heavily reliant on orthodoxy. And we have these scenes of these people kissing the icons, like these things. That's what we do in the Orthodox Church. We kind of venerate the icons. We're not worshiping the icons supposedly, but we're sort of just they manifest the spirit and sort of the glory of the saints, and obviously the resurrection of Jesus. Whereas Catholicism focuses more on the suffering of Christ, whereas Orthodoxy is more like about the resurrection. And that's why, Pascha and Easter and all that stuff is such a big deal to the Orthodox Christians, for that reason. So as he came to himself, our hero realized he was standing in the middle of the room and staring in an almost boorishly impolite fashion at a most respectable looking old man who, having finished his dinner and said grace before the icon, had now sat down again and for his part seemed unable to take his eyes from Mr. Galyakin. Looking vaguely about him, our hero saw that everybody, absolutely everybody, was gazing at him with the most severe and suspicious expression. Reminds me of the Netflix series You. That guy was talking to his alter ego. Yeah, I heard about that. It's very similar. Denise Reynolds from It's Always Sunny. I'll have to check those out. I have heard about that one that Dreama mentioned. And that's why this theme is kind of so poignant, and so relevant, because it's kind of like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, but it's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde obviously is more like a mystery novel. It's fun, this is just complete darkness and paranoia and nihilism. I think it's important to read Dostoevsky. I couldn't read Dostoevsky all the time. It's not the epic, beautiful grandiosity that you get with Leo Tolstoy, like War and Peace or something, right? Of course, Tolstoy had some, references to nihilism and, and Anna Karenina and some of his other characters, but it's not that real hopeful sort of vision. With Dostoevsky, it's just one suffering after another. Now, this was written before, I want to say before Dostoevsky was sent to a penal colony in Siberia, because they thought he was conspiring against, the oligarchy or the czars or something like that. I forgot exactly what the case was, but they basically put him in a Russian Siberian penal colony. And but this was written before that. But you're like I said, you already get the sense that Dostoevsky is willing to go into the trenches and really explore the depths of human insanity, and that's kind of what we get with Dostoevsky, for sure. It says here, suddenly he started violently and almost shrieked in horror. A new light was dawning on him. The dark, reddish, disgusting looking liquid shone with an evil gleam in Mr. Galyatkin's eyes. The bottle dropped from his hands and smashed on the floor. So basically, his doctor, Kristen Ivanovich, had prescribed 3 or 4 days earlier this little bottle of medicine. So it's very like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. He drinks this medicine, and that sort of makes you think that his doctor is setting him up. I think his doctor is setting him up. Now, the doctor and all these other people, they're not the reason that they're not causing the double. The double is already there, but these people are kind of just waiting for this guy to fail, right? They're kind of like pointing and laughing at Mr. Galyatkin. It's quite pitiful, and whatever this medicine is breaks Galyatkin's spirit for some reason, or it subdues him, maybe perhaps, and allows him to sort of submit to Dr. Christian Ivanovich. And we're coming towards the tail end of the book here. There's just a few more things I want to point out. I really appreciate you guys listening to me rant. Looks like we got 6 people in here, and the stream will get more views as time goes on. I'll check up with your guys' comments here in a second. So struggle to maintain his relationship with Petrushka. So in the beginning of the novel, when we started the stream, he had this sort of comical sort of back and forth, relationship, sort of harmless trolling relationship with Petrushka. But, we sort of got the sense that Petrushka was maybe looking after him and vice versa. But we're not really completely sure by this point. He starts arguing with Petrushka and all this kind of stuff. And now he says here, here's a man on his way to destruction, a man losing his identity, and he can hardly control himself. And you talk about a wedding, and how will it all end? How will it be settled now? I give a lot to know. Now they're talking about, I forgot whose wedding they're talking about here. All kinds of different Russian characters. It's confusing as all heck. But the core of what's really going on is not very hard to follow. His Excellency turned away. For a few moments, our hero's eyes could distinguish nothing. His chest felt tight. He was short of breath. He had no idea where he was. He felt somehow ashamed and dejected. God knows what happened next. When he came to himself, His Excellency was talking to his guests and seemed to be having a sharp and emphatic discussion with them. Mr. Galyatkin recognized one of the guests at once. It was Andrei Pilapovich. He did not know the other. So basically, the double is basically continuing to humiliate him in these social settings. So we have a reference to a mirror. He starts looking in a mirror and starts to see the other side of himself and stuff like that. So here we sort of have the, who's he talking to here? This is important here. Mr. Galyatkin. Yeah, it's almost like, from what I gather from this part, he's having an internal dialogue with an ideal woman. Maybe that woman Martha, or what was her name? Forgot what her name was. We talked about her earlier, but that his ideal woman, or that woman that he's interested in. Fiancés, madam, will come along in their own good time. Of course, it is no doubt necessary to have acquired some accomplishments, such as playing on the piano, speaking French, knowing history, geography, scripture, and arithmetic, but there's no need to go any further. Then there's cookery. Besides, cookery should certainly be within every properly conducted young lady's province. And he sort of talks about the role of women in marriage, or what the ideal wife would be. And sort of like in Notes from the Underground, when he had that relationship with Liza, the prostitute, this is a little bit different, but he's sort of having a sort of a, he's talking to Petrushka, I think, but he's sort of saying, he's speaking towards an ideal woman or his ideal wife or lack thereof. Um, so, and sort of what his expectations would be. Um, Now there's a struggle with all of this. You know, Mr. Galyakin's ideal person, his ideal society, his ideal interests, they're all in conflict with sort of what's going on, you know, because he denounces, for example, and nowadays in our individual age, madam, tender words are not in fashion. The days of Jean Jacques Rousseau are past. Nowadays, for example, a husband comes home from work hungry and says, "What about a bite to eat, darling, and a glass of vodka and a bit of herring?" So he's sort of, you know, rejecting the Enlightenment almost or something. I guess is kind of what he's getting at. Or maybe he's just so crazy, he's just kind of talking off the cuff. Um, so basically, the end of the novel, we're at the last couple pages of the book here. He shows up at Al-Safui, Al-Sufi Ivanovich's window. So he's basically, this is one of his co-workers or something, one of the upper echelon people in the society that he's trying to espouse to or something. Basically, he shows up at his house and he's looking from the outside and he's kind of hiding behind this stack of logs for some reason. He's looking into the house. And this is when he sort of sees the degradation of his soul. Um, all at once he started and almost cowered, numb with shock. It had begun to seem to him, in fact, he had completely realized that they were not just looking for somebody or something in general, they were looking for him. Mr. Galyatkin, everybody was gazing in his direction and pointing towards him. It was impossible to run away. They could see him. Numbly, Mr. Galyatkin cowered as close to the logs as he could, and only then noticed that he had been betrayed by the treacherous shadow which did not entirely cover him. If it had only been possible, our hero would most gladly have crept then and there into some little mouse hole among the logs and crouched there in peace. So you get the sense that this narrator is always wanting to hide. He always wants to get out of these social situations. His social anxiety is like debilitating. And now it's all kind of going down the tubes. Then he grew hot with shame. He was definitely discovered. Everybody had seen him at the same moment. They were all waving their hands, nodding their heads, and mouthing at him. Now several windows were pushed open with a crack, and several voices at once were audible calling to him. "I wonder they don't whip those girls when they're children," our flustered hero grumbled to himself. Not sure what he's talking about there. Suddenly he, we will all know, ran down the steps without hat or overcoat. So basically, now it's confusing because we don't know if, like, these people have known that this, obviously they've known he's crazy all along, right? But at the same point in time, they're sort of watching him. That's why they're all pointing and laughing and talking about him, because they're finally seeing him submit to his own mental state. He's blaming others or his alter ego. Reminds me of the Carl Jung quote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." Yeah, exactly. And there's definitely that. I read a couple blogs about the double and they definitely had that Carl Jung quote in there. So yeah, that's definitely what's happening. Like, he's not being honest with himself, and his sort of subconscious is boiling out of the volcano of his consciousness, so to speak. So basically, now I wrote here, forever an outsider. Galyakin looking through the windows from outside, forever an outsider, and that's kind of all you need to know as far as that part goes. He will always be an outsider, and we get the sense that Galyakin will not be able to be saved. The people are just kind of throwing him to the wolves here. Now he basically goes. They sort of Dr. Petrovich and Galyakin Jr. sort of coerced the real Galyatkin into a wagon, and basically they're sort of letting Mr. Galyatkin rant, right? But all the while, they're basically, the book ends, they're taking him into the madhouse. They've got him in their control. They've been giving him medication. They've probably been spying on him. They're probably working. Now, to what level are they conspiring against him? Are they just trying to get him the mental help that he needs? Or are they trying to convince him that he's crazy so that he will submit to them and they can throw him in the madhouse? That's also a possibility. So basically, the last 2 pages is basically they're hauling him off to the madhouse. And it said he talks about the anxiety that he feels in the carriage and all that stuff. Um, let's see here. Mr. Galyakin's head ached dully. The hot blood throbbed in his head. He was suffocating. He felt like tearing open his clothes, baring his chest, plastering it with snow, pouring cold water over it. He fell at last into unconsciousness. When he came to himself, he saw that the horses were bearing him along an unfamiliar road. To right and left, the forest loomed blackly. All around was silent and deserted. Suddenly, his heart almost stopped beating. 2 fiery eyes were watching him in the darkness, and they shone like malignant, hellish joy. This was not Christian Ivanovich Galyakin. Who was it? Or was it he? Yes, this was Christian Ivanovich, but not the same one, a different Christian Ivanovich, a fearful Christian Ivanovich. So for some reason now, he's referring to himself. So he's not talking about himself. He's talking about this other guy that he's perceiving. Uh, as soon as Mr. Galyakin had stated that he put his fate completely. Okay, so this is basically the guy that's going along with Dr. Petrovich, I think, or something. It's the guy that's coercing him into the wagon so they can take him to the carriage to take him to the madhouse. So, but what are those fiery eyes that he sees in the forest? It's almost like he's having some kind of demonic vision and paranoia of this Christian Ivanovich figure. Christian Ivanovich, I think I'm all right. Christian Ivanovich, our hero, began in a timid and trembling voice, trying to nullify his terrifying Christian Ivanovich, at any rate, a little by meekness and submission. You will have official quarters with firewood, and there's some letter I don't understand, linked, LICHT, and service, which do you which you do not deserve. Christian Ivanovich's answer rang out like a stern and terrible sentence of a judge. So basically, it says here, our hero shrieked and clutched at his head. Alas, this was what he had known for a long time would happen. And that just says 1846. So basically, they're throwing him to the wolves, and I assume they're taking him to the madhouse. That's pretty much what's going on. It doesn't exactly say where they're taking him or what kind of facility he's going to or anything like that. Or they're taking him off into the woods, and he's in and out of consciousness, and he's now under the thumb of the people that are going to throw him into the madhouse. So the character did not really succeed, obviously. So I'm just going to read some of your old comments here. Christian versus Fission, fake Christian. Yeah, is that in here? I'm not sure what you meant by that, but yeah, I see what you're getting at. Maybe he's sort of saying that these people are not very Christian, right? So that's basically the double in a nutshell. Now, obviously, there's a lot of things in the plot that are just hard to remember. They're hard to kind of organize. They're hard to put the puzzle pieces together. I think if I understood the plot a little bit better, I'd be able to understand sort of the introspection a little bit more. But I think in terms of the psychology of the book and sort of the nihilistic narrative and the paranoia, it's better to understand the emotional and the mental sort of introspection, and then what happens outside of that basically kind of just puts that into context or vice versa. So okay, it says no my words. Yeah, I got you. So yeah, we're basically dealing with a lot of crazy stuff in the double. But in a nutshell, it's about a man's almost schizophrenic paranoia, his mental breaking point, right? But to what extent is this actually happening? Does anybody else really see the double, or does Petrovich, I think that's his name, right? These Russian names are killing me. Or Galyakin. Does Galyakin actually, does anybody actually see the other Galyakin, or is that just a manifestation of the author's, the narrator's insanity? So that's pretty much it as far as the double goes. You guys can read some other synopsises online and stuff like that. Hopefully, I gave you guys a pretty interesting, um, sort of maybe esoteric, a little bit less highbrow sort of interpretation of it. But it's Russian nihilism, but it's Russian nihilism in the context of mental and emotional insanity, social anxiety, paranoia. But there's also sort of a spiritual element to it. He talks about the double as this entity. He talks about the fiery red eyes, and he talks about the masked balls. He talks about the kiss of Judas. So there's almost a Christian underlying sort of peripheral Christian theme of betrayal and the the sort of the trying to espouse to this higher spiritual realm that's completely unattainable for this type of person or this narrator. So I appreciate you guys hanging in here. I was just wondering how you would pronounce all those Russian names. Yeah, it's difficult. I'm not too good at it, but that's pretty much it, guys. You guys can go back and review the stream, for different things, and I hope it'll get some more views in the future. And if there's a particular book, or poem or play or something that you want me to read and do a live stream on or something, let me know. I'm definitely open to doing that. You can leave it in the comments of my next video, or just leave it in the comments of here once the stream is up. And I think that's it. I hope you guys have a really good rest of your weekend. Could the narrator coming to terms with understand that the crazed double is what everyone sees? Could it be the narrator coming to terms with understand that the crazed double is what everyone sees? Yeah, that's a possibility. Now, when you say the crazed double, do you mean himself? Because the double is not really crazy. Like, the double is supposed to be the better version of himself, right? At least it's supposed to be. But that's intriguing. I'm not sure how I would interpret that. The crazed double is what everyone sees. Yeah, that's possible. Is the double maybe real in the sense that the double is being reenacted through Mr. Galyakin? And that's what everybody is seeing, maybe. Is that kind of what you're saying? Or are you saying that the real Mr. Galyakin is maybe the double? Is that possible? Maybe that's what. They are both him. The rational one is the narrator. Yeah, that's possible, but he's kind of an unreliable narrator, isn't he? That's interesting. You could almost do a whole nother stream just on that, but yeah, they're both kind of irrational, because the double is kind of taking advantage of the real Galyakin, right? But yeah, that's what I mean with Dostoevsky. It's like it just melts your brain. It's like a mind fuck or something. You know what I mean? It really scratches your brain in a really strange, odd way. So there you have it, guys. I appreciate it. And we'll definitely be doing this again soon. And is there anything else you guys want to add to the table of conversation, or should I just call it a night here? I'd like to know what Dreama thinks. If Dreama's still in here, what does she think of the double? And what do you think of the double too, Dolly? What do you think is actually going on? I like how you described him hiding behind some logs at the end, in the pitiful way they were all out. Yeah, it's real pitiful. It's like, it's kind of disturbing what kind of happens to this character. But for some reason, with Dostoevsky's characters, they're kind of like, you can relate so much to them, but at the same time, they're like, I don't know if it's because it's like a Russian thing or something, but they're kind of hard to relate to. You can't really quite figure them out no matter what you do. So if I'm struggling with, those small Dostoevsky novels, I can't imagine what it's going to be like when we get to like Crime and Punishment or something like that. That's like his magnum opus. I want to read it. It sounds just like the Netflix series. Yeah, maybe I should watch the Netflix series. Um, so I think as Dostoevsky's sort of as his trajectory goes on, he starts dealing with maybe more profound themes and a little less of the mental illness and paranoia and crazy stuff. But he's also got this other one called Humiliated and Insulted. Uh, it's Humiliated and Insulted, which is like a novel about an aspiring author. So this seems really interesting too. So he's got a lot of material, but you have to figure out if that's what you want to read. Like I said, I can't read Dostoevsky all the time because it's just so heavy and kind of dark. I'm going to find this book and read it. You going over it gives me an idea of what will be going on in the book. Yeah, you could even listen to it on YouTube, I think. That's a good way to kind of listen to it too, or an audiobook or something. He wants so much to be good, but his evil side is so strong. Only once he reconciles the two sides of himself can he finally be okay. Yeah, and will he ever be okay? It's called You. Okay. I'm gonna check that out. Yeah, that's kind of the underlying question is like what's actually going on with this guy. It's like he knows that he's gonna die, or he knows that the double is destroying him, but he's unable to kind of come to terms with that, right? Reading Turgenev helped me recover from Dostoevsky. Okay, yeah, what's his name? Alexander Turgenev or something. He's another Russian author. Yeah, you've got Tolstoy, you've got Gogol, you've got Turgenev, you've got Nabokov, you've got obviously Nabokov is much different, but you got a lot of guys in that kind of nihilist genre, but they're not all nihilists. Like Tolstoy's not a nihilist, and I wouldn't even say that when I say nihilism, like that's just kind of like the surface level of Dostoevsky. Obviously, there's a lot of other important themes about relationships and love and self growth and psychology and all that stuff. But it's sort of, at least with these earlier books, it's sort of very heavily tinged with this insane, dark, nihilistic realism, I guess you could say. So before I keep yakking on, this is a great conversation, but I want to get this video up there. But we'll see you guys next time. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Looks like we had, 4 or 5, 6 people consistently hanging out in here. So that was really cool. And we will be ready for the next one. And if you guys want me to maybe cover something real specific, maybe have a list of stuff, send me an email at andrewmarlowe22@gmail.com, or you can just leave something in the comments and I will check up on that later. Looking forward to your review of the Humiliated and Insulted, it's called. So God bless. Have a good weekend, guys. And thanks you for listening.